All right, today we're going to dive into American history for really the first time in world history. Here we are in October, and we're finally getting into the history of our country. So, last class we talked about European conquests and colonies in the New World, and also talked a little bit about colonial America before the American Revolution. So, today we are going to get into the American Revolution. Before we get into the actual content, here are the 13 colonies of British controlled America. So, by the mid 1700s, these 13 colonies were established on what we now know as the east coast of the U.S., and these were controlled by Great Britain. All right, so the 13 colonies, you have New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Those are the New England colonies. Then you had New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. And then you had the southern colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, the rest of this is fill in the blank notes. As I told you before when we did fill in the blank notes, do not just skip ahead and copy down the words without listening. Listen to the entire thing. Otherwise, you will not comprehend what I say. You will not know the information for the test. So during the 1700s, each of the 13 colonies were very similar. They had very similar political and legal systems. It's not like each one was a different country. They had similar cultures, similar political and legal systems, and they were dominated by Protestant English speakers. Most people there spoke English. Most people there were Protestant. The only exception, really, were a lot of colonists in Maryland. Maryland was one of the only Catholic areas named Maryland after the Virgin Mary. And the British government controlled and operated these colonies. The British government, we call it Parliament, okay, kind of like our Congress. They make laws, they enact legislation, and they controlled and operated these colonies under a policy of mercantilism. Mercantilism. Okay, you may never have heard that word before, but this meant that the colonial economies were based on trade and obtaining materials like gold and silver and other valuables for the benefit of their mother country, Great Britain. That was always the goal of mercantilism, was what would benefit the mother country the most, in this case, Great Britain. So the goal of mercantilism was to acquire the most wealth, in this case, gold, because a country's power, according to this theory, came from its wealth. The wealthier you were, the more powerful you are. And a mercantilist country sought to get gold in two different ways. The first way was by establishing and exploiting colonies, as you see here with the 13 colonies, establishing those colonies and then getting raw materials from them. And then the second way that a mercantilist country like Britain would get gold was in establishing a favorable balance of trade with its rival countries. Now, this economic policy kept Britain very competitive financially with other European powers because the resource-rich colonies here in America could only trade with the mother country, Great Britain. So that made them really wealthy and competitive with other countries like France and Spain. Now, the 13 colonies were very self-sufficient, and they resisted London's demand for more control because they didn't think they needed it. They made everything on their own and felt like they didn't really need the help of the mother country, even though they were in charge. Now, since the colonists saw this as a one-way relationship, naturally they wanted a way out. Okay, a one-way relationship, they thought it was they give and Britain takes. There's no real reciprocity there. It's not a symbiotic relationship. They say that Britain is the only one getting anything out of this relationship, and the colonies were not. So in the 1750s, the colonies began kind of collaborating with each other instead of dealing directly with Britain. They would trade within their colonies and talk within their colonies instead of going through Britain, the middleman. Now, this created a sense of shared American identity. People started to see themselves more as Americans than only as Virginians or Pennsylvanians or New Yorkers. They would see themselves as in a similar identity to colonists from other American colonies. And this led to a lot of colonists seeing their ties to Britain as burdensome and now unnecessary, that they didn't really need to be tied to Britain anymore. Yes, Britain established them. A lot of them were immigrants from Britain, but they did not feel like they needed to be tied to Britain anymore and thought that their connection to Britain was very burdensome, very difficult for them, and not very beneficial for them. But still, British Parliament passed laws that very strictly governed the colonies. They were beginning to tighten their grip on the colonies as the colonies were looking for a way out of the relationship. Now, one set of laws banned the colonists from trading with any other nation than Britain, as I said before, and this was seen as very harmful for America because if you can trade with a bunch of other countries, you can kind of set your price. Whereas if you're only trading with one country, they set the price. Now, this was very good for Britain's economy, but not so great for the economy of the colonies. Now, in addition to these very overly strict trade regulations, the very high cost of the French and Indian War was a burden on the Americans as well. Remember, the French and Indian War cost a lot of money, caused Britain to go into debt. And because Britain went into so much debt, the Parliament decided to tax colonists at a very high rate. Now, naturally, the colonists thought this was unfair because they were the ones who fought and won that war, and now they're having to foot the bill for it. They're the ones having to pay high taxes in order to pay Britain's debt that was accrued during that time. So this made the colonists very angry, and since Parliament had no members from the colonists said that parliaments had no right to tax the colonies because colonists did not have representatives in London looking out for their interests. So they declared that there should be no taxation without representation, probably a phrase you've heard before, started around this time, and they said if we are not represented in Parliament, in the government, we don't have people looking out for our interests, then we shouldn't be taxed. And that was their big cry there, no taxation without representation. Now, the Stamp Act was the first tax. We're going to be talking about a couple different acts and taxes that were put on the colonists. And in 1765, the Stamp Act required a stamp to be put on all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, etc. You might think, okay, so what? I mean, it's a stamp. All right, that's not too bad. But the stamps cost money. You had to buy these stamps, and the money would go straight to the British government. And the colonists thought this was unfair because every sheet of paper that they would distribute, every newspaper had to have a stamp that was bought from London. They did not think that was fair. So they responded to this with a boycott of British goods. So a boycott, if you don't know, that's where you stop buying something, you resist in that way. So if you were to boycott Walmart, you would stop going to Walmart. You try to get all your friends to stop going there as well in order to prove some sort of a point. Now, their refusal to buy British products was very effective, and it forced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act because without colonists buying British goods, very little money is coming into London. All right, so Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in order to end the boycott, and it worked really well. But the taxes did not stop there. Okay, in 1767, Britain passed the Townshend Acts. And this taxed colonists for things like tea, paper, glass, all sorts of other items that they would use on a daily basis. And colonists protested this as well. Now, Britain reacted very harshly to this insubordination, and they increased their troop presence in the colonies. Okay, they sent over their own soldiers. British soldiers were called redcoats because of their uniforms, and they increased their troop presence in the colonies, and America was seen as like occupied territory. Now, over the next decade, the colonists and Britain grew further and further apart because of these divisions and misunderstandings and differences of opinion. Now, this increased troop presence in the American colonies led to the Boston Massacre, probably something you've heard of, in 1770. So angered by the presence of troops and Britain's colonial policies as well, a crowd formed in Boston, and they started to harass a group of British soldiers that were guarding the customs house. They started to throw snowballs at them because it was in the middle of winter, and a British soldier was knocked down by a thrown snowball, hit him in the face, and as he was falling to the ground, he accidentally discharged his weapon. He accidentally fired his musket. Now, this sparked a volley into the crowd that killed 5 citizens. Whenever other British soldiers heard that gunshot, they said, "Oh, time to fire. I guess our captain wants us to shoot." And so they shot into the crowd, and this killed 5 civilians, including a man named Crispus Attucks. Now, 5 people dying is horrible, but whenever you hear the word massacre, do you think of 5 people dying, or do you think of like 100 or 1,000 people dying? That's what I think of when I hear the word massacre, but 5 doesn't really qualify as a massacre. However, This relatively minor shooting was named the Boston Massacre in order to stir up colonial support for independence from Britain. It was the American colonists who called it the Boston Massacre in order to make it sound more extreme than it was, in order to get more support for their cause. Now, in 1773, British Parliament passed the Tea Act. And this heavily taxed tea, of course, which colonists drank a great deal of. They would drink tea every single day, like a lot of Americans today drink coffee or soda. They would drink tea all the time, especially since water was not very sanitary to drink. And angered by this Tea Act, a group of colonists dressed as Native Americans, and they were led by Samuel Adams. I think they called themselves the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Indians and snuck into the British trade ship in Boston. The British trade ship with a lot of tea on it that was going to be taxed. And whenever they got into the ship, they dumped nearly $1 million worth of East India Company tea into the Boston harbor, turned the harbor brown, just dumped all of the tea into the harbor. Now, this became known as the Boston Tea Party, another thing you probably heard of. Now, people who resisted British occupation and taxation were called patriots, and those who were loyal to Britain were called Tories. In 1774, British Parliament passed another act, which became known as the Intolerable Acts. Okay, again, that was a label that was put on by Americans because they said we can't tolerate these terrible acts of legislation. So this legislation stripped Massachusetts of the right to self-government and judicial independence following the Boston Tea Party. Britain basically said, okay, you're going to act like children, you're going to waste all of this money of ours and dump all of our commodities into the harbor. Well, guess what? You just lost your privilege of self-government. Now, the colonies responded to the Intolerable Acts with a general boycott of all British goods. And then representatives from each of the colonies met in Philadelphia at what became known as the First Continental Congress in 1774, and they formed an army. They formed an army because they said, okay, it looks like war is on the horizon. Britain is not backing down, neither are we, and there's probably going to be war. So they founded an army in the First Continental Congress. Then on April 18th, 1775, British regular troops landed in Massachusetts prepared for war. Both sides were getting prepared for war, and British troops landed in Massachusetts. Now, a guy named Paul Revere and his friend William Dawes, they rode from Boston to the country towns of Lexington and Concord in order to warn the Minutemen, which were the soldiers in the colonial militia that were supposed to be ready at a minute's notice for battle. They warned the Minutemen that the British regular troops had arrived. So the battles of Lexington and Concord were the first engagements of what became known as the Revolutionary War, or the American Revolution. Now, Lexington and Concord was a strategic victory for the American colonists. British forces did succeed in destroying a lot of cannon and ammunition and supplies in Concord, but the colonial militia was successful and was able to drive the British back to Boston. So it was seen as a strategic victory for the American colonists, first battles of the war. Then in June of that year, 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. George Washington was a veteran soldier. He had been in the French and Indian War, very skilled, very intelligent, and he was named the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Now, that same month, the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought, and this was the first major battle of the war. It was in Boston. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed, and only about 300 Americans were killed. Now, this still ended in a British victory because they were able to capture the hill, but Britain obviously suffered many more casualties than the Americans. So it was still seen as encouraging for the Americans, the fact that they were able to fight off Britain. Okay, now at this time, Britain was the most powerful country in the world at the time. They had the most powerful navy, and here this tiny group of colonies rebels against them. Everyone thought this was going to be the shortest war ever, that it was going to last like a week and it would be stomped out. So just to think that the colonists are having all these surprise victories. They were very much the underdogs in this war. Everybody thought Britain was going to win because they were so powerful militarily. But America, of course, ended up winning. In July of 1775, Congress wrote a document called the Olive Branch Petition and sent it to King George III of England. So he had been king from 1760 until this time. And this olive branch petition, an olive branch, like if you extend an olive branch to someone, that's like trying to extend peace or goodwill to them, trying to end fighting. And in this document, America asked for the ending of the Intolerable Acts in exchange for a ceasefire, which means the fighting would stop as long as Britain repealed the Intolerable Acts. But King George rejected this proposal. He said, we can't negotiate with these rebels here. We need to squash them. That way they know not to mess with England anymore. So he rejected this proposal, and on August 23rd, 1775, declared the colonies to be in open rebellion, official declaration of war. Now, in January of 1776, a guy named Thomas Paine, who was a writer, an American writer of the Enlightenment, very much an Enlightenment thinker, he published a pamphlet entitled Common Sense. Really good book, short book if you ever want to read it. It's about 60 pages, really interesting book. And this pamphlet was published in Philadelphia and explained why America needs to become independent from Britain and King George III. That's common sense, that this is what we must do because of the tyrannical actions of King George III. So this writing became very widespread, very influential because of the printing press, okay, and because by this point literacy had increased quite a bit. And in May of 1776, France began to support the colonists. Now think, why would France support the colonists? Well, of course, it's because they hated England. Remember, France and England have historically been enemies. Remember the 100 Years' War, several other wars and conflicts as well between these two countries. They have always been at each other's throats up until the 20th century. So at this time, they were still enemies, and they supported the American colonists because they wanted England to lose colonies and lose power and lose money. So on July 4th, 1776, shortly after France became one of our allies, the Declaration of Independence was signed. So this document was written by Thomas Jefferson, who would eventually become the third president of the United States, and it was signed unanimously by representatives from all 13 colonies. Unanimously means everybody signed it. Every single person in the Continental Congress signed this Declaration of Independence. So this officially separated the American colonies from Great Britain. This is seen as the beginning, the official beginning of the United States of America. Now, while 20% of American colonists still remained loyal to Britain throughout the war, and only about 80% encouraged and supported independence, this is seen as the birth of the United States over 240 years ago. King George and British Parliament, in response to this, refused to recognize America as an independent country. They said, no, okay, you can declare that you're an independent country, but you're not. You're still a part of England. You're still a part of our empire. And the British and the American armies continued to fight for several years after the Declaration was signed. A lot of people think the war ended after the Declaration of Independence, but not at all. It went on for years after the Declaration of Independence was declared. So the Americans were led by General Washington, as we said, and the British were led by a guy named Cornwallis, General Cornwallis, both very skilled, very intelligent, and strategic military minds. And when the war began in 1775, the British thought it would be a very easy victory. As I said, everyone in the world, whenever they heard about this in the newspapers, thought that this would be a very easy victory for Great Britain. They had the largest military in the world, the best navy in the world, and the colonies were not even an organized country. However, the colonists knew the terrain, okay, they had home field advantage, and they devoted all of their efforts and all of their supplies to the war. Okay, their hearts were completely in it. And they had a lot more to fight for than the Redcoats. Everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence, if we had lost the war, they would have all been killed because of this act of what the British called treason. So we had a lot more to fight for in that way, and the Americans were also helped a lot by the aid of the French. Okay, we owe a lot to the French for helping us win the American Revolution. After years of very expensive fighting, the British people grew very tired of the cost of the war, especially since they weren't really seeing any results, and so the British people pushed Parliament to agree on a treaty that would end the war. They said, who cares what these 13 colonies do? Okay, we're having our own men die over there overseas for colonies we don't even care about, we've never seen, we never will see. Let's stop this fighting. That way we can lower taxes again and have a thriving economy again. So the British surrender at the Battle of Yorktown ended the fighting, and this was in 1781, several years after the war began. And then in 1783, the two sides signed a treaty called the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Now, in this, Great Britain recognized the independent United States of America, making it official in the eyes of the rest of the world. The 13 colonies then formed a new government under the Articles of Confederation. That was our first governing document in the 1780s. And this government was very weak. States held pretty much all the power. The central government had next to no power at all. There wasn't really a balance of power there at all. They couldn't really collect taxes or anything like that, couldn't organize a national military. And this really proved unworkable for several reasons. So in 1787, American representatives met again and said, okay, the Articles of Confederation are not working. We need to create a new framework of government if we want this new Enlightenment-based country to last. So this meeting was called the Constitutional Convention in order to make a lasting, better, stronger governing document. And boy, did they succeed. The very large state of Virginia, who met at this convention with the other states, they wanted the number of representatives from each state in the federal government to be based on the size of the state. Okay, so a big question was, how are we going to determine which state gets how many representatives in government, like how many senators or congressmen come from each state? And Virginia was one of the largest states in population, so naturally they said bigger states should have more representatives. But then the small state of New Jersey said, no, 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 it shouldn't be based on size. We should all get the same number of representatives in Congress. And of course, they wanted that because they were small, so they wanted to be seen as equal to the bigger states, regardless of population. So something called the Great Compromise was reached by the representatives from Connecticut, and this created two houses of Congress. Okay? Our Congress is bicameral. We have a bicameral legislature, which means we have two houses of Congress. We have the House of Representatives, and then we have the Senate. Now, the House of Representatives currently has 435 congressmen in it. Okay? Mississippi has 4. I think California has 55. So that means that it is based on population. Okay? The House of Representatives is based on population. It's directly in response to how many people you have in your state. That's how many representatives you get. So, for example, Wyoming, who has the smallest population, they only have 1 representative in the House of Representatives. But Texas, which is really big, has over 30 representatives in the House of Representatives. But then the Senate is where each state gets exactly 2 representatives. Wyoming gets 2, Mississippi gets 2, Texas gets 2, California gets 2. Every state gets exactly 2 representatives, no more, no less, which means there is a total of 100 senators currently because there are 50 states, 2 from each state. Now, James Madison was the writer of the Constitution. He helped come to this compromise, and he brilliantly wrote the Constitution to make it very strong and very lasting. He used ideas from several Enlightenment thinkers, including Montesquieu, as we've talked about. Montesquieu's idea of the separation of powers. He used this by creating the 3 branches of government. If you've ever heard of the 3 branches of government, you have the legislative branch, which is Congress, okay, Senate and the House of Representatives. Then you have the executive branch, which is the president, and then you have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. He said this is the way to go about it, through a system of checks and balances, making sure that each branch is able to prevent the other branches from abusing their power or getting too powerful. The Constitution also established a federal system in which power was divided pretty much evenly between national and state governments. Okay, so state governments have rights of their own and powers of their own, and then the national federal government has powers as well. It's not that one is stronger than the other. He made a balance there. So the Constitution of the United States was first ratified by the state of Delaware. They became the first state. In order for this to go into effect, 9 of the 13 colonies had to ratify it or approve it. And once they ratified it or approved it, they became states. Now, eventually, all 13 colonies, then states, approved it. And in 1789, enough states had ratified the Constitution to pass it into law. So up until 1789. Ever since then, we have been under the Constitution of the United States. It is still in effect to this very day. It is the longest living document of government. It is the longest surviving constitution. Okay? Our constitution has been around for longer than any other countries because other countries have changed their constitution many times in the past couple of years, whereas we have kept the same constitution. So it really shows how strong and how important our constitution is and why it is worth protecting. All right, so that is the American Revolution in short. So let me know if you have any questions about that.